and welcome back to the live series podcast brought to you by Amicus. This is the podcast that gives you insight into the life and role of tech leaders from all over the world. Today, I'm joined by Gavin van Lelyveld, a consultant over at Deconstructing Leadership. I am super excited to have Gavin on today. We've chatted a little bit before, and sometimes, when you just get a guest and you're chatting before the actual recording and you just feel like you really click about something, in this particular subject today, that's definitely the case. So thank you so much for coming on, Gavin. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I had the same experience chatting to you before. You asked me a few questions and it was like, oh, there's a lot to say. Yeah, this is really interesting. And I enjoyed the back and forth we had. So I've really been looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, no, me too, 100%. It's quite interesting what we're going to be talking about. I think it's something that kind of gets mentioned in passing. The idea of psychological safety and dealing with that as a leadership. It's not necessarily something that gets deep dived into too much. So I'm really chuffed to kind of get going with that. But before we kind of dive into any of that, just for anybody who hasn't heard of you or heard of your work or Deconstructing Leadership, do you want to just kind of maybe walk us through your experience up to now?
Yeah. I'll go right back to before the beginning. I'm a second generation software engineer, which is really relatively rare for someone my age. My dad was writing COBOL back in the 80s. I studied tech, studied coding, got my first job as a web dev in the late 90s, early 2000s, and in a small agency. And I worked my way up that organization to basically be leading the small team of engineers that were there. And that's how I discovered that I enjoy leadership and wanted to be a leader. Because I did a bunch of research and found out stuff and started practicing it and was like, oh, this is great. I enjoy this way more than like coding, like talking to people, helping them develop, getting their goals. And so instead of sticking with that, I was like, I'm going to start my own business. And I went into freelancing with this grand ambitions of starting my own agency. No, I basically was solo for 7 years because I didn't have the chops to run a small business, but I always missed leadership and missed kind of wanting to work on that stuff. So I got back into the industry, did a bit of Scrum Mastery, became a full-time software engineering manager in 2016, and managing a couple of teams. And then through a few jobs since then, I've managed kind of bigger teams in different kinds of organizations, managed managers. And I got to a point where I realized I really want to talk more about these topics. I think really my mission is to transform tech by bringing more people from underrepresented groups into leadership. I think like that's my passion, that's my driving force, and I want to do that by talking about it, writing about it, speaking to people, and talking to as many companies as I can about it. So I decided to start consulting, start doing my own thing. And I haven't been doing it too long, just over a year. And it's been an interesting journey so far. And I don't feel I've quite clicked yet. But I love that I get opportunities like this to talk to people and like share these concepts and ideas. Yeah.
Amazing. I know you mentioned there a little bit about kind of being solo for 7 years, but you really wanted to kind of come back into it and become kind of a little bit more of a leader. What
Yeah.
you said you missed it as well. So what
Yeah.
kind of what drew you initially to that leadership kind of mentality? Because obviously we're going to cover kind of the things that what it takes to be a successful leader and what it takes to be kind
Yeah.
of a good leader in terms of how your team feel. But what
Yeah.
initially drew you towards, like, what made you think I want to be a leader? Because I'm thinking maybe people listening or something can think, well, everybody wants to climb the ladder, right? But what actually is the difference between just wanting to climb the ladder and getting the title, and what actually
Yeah.
makes you realize that you are actually drawn towards leadership and that you could be really good at it?
Yeah. My experience was just from feeling dissatisfied with my manager and wanting more. And I then researched a bunch of stuff online about what good management looked like, and I ended up listening to a podcast called the Manager Tools Podcast. These two are kind of senior American managers talking about servant leadership, talking about like being effective leaders that deliver. And they developed a lot of tools, like they described how to do a one-to-one, and they had a great one-to-one sheet. And when I took over this team, I was like, let me try this stuff. And so I sat down and like very crudely worked through these things with the people on my team, and they responded so positively. It was like, and even years after, people said, wow, that was the first time anyone had asked me about my own goals or spoken to me about my family or just showed interest. And I realized I loved that. I loved the opportunity to get the best out of people, to connect with people. Like, yeah, I love coding and tech, but I've always been an average developer at best. But yeah, it was something I was genuinely good at, that used all my skills. And so kind of what pushed me into it was realizing I wasn't happy with the quality of management I was receiving, which looking back was partly me and partly them. And then just being invested in like growing people and developing people and realizing what a difference that can make to a business and to not just individuals, but to the actual overall work of the team.
I love that. And especially, who's not going to appreciate a leader who's genuinely interested in the individual's mindset and their mentality when they're at work, because there's such a thing as oversharing at work, right? And but being a successful leader doesn't mean that you have to know the ins and outs of people's personal lives necessarily. But psychological safety is a thing. Let's get into it. What is it? And what does it look like, especially within a tech team?
Yeah. Psychological safety basically is when people in the team, both as individuals but like in the collective, believe that they can take risks, they can try things, they can make mistakes, they can speak up and point out things that they observe, they can ask difficult questions, and they know that they're not going to be punished for it. They know that they're not going to be insulted or criticized, in a personal way for doing that. That they really feel valued as individuals for their own strengths and weaknesses, and that they can come to work and do the best that they can. And that's not something that's really unique to tech teams. Psychological safety is good in any kind of organization. I think what's unique to tech is tech companies and tech teams tend to talk about this stuff more. They tend to want to build psychological safety in teams, to spend the time and energy on doing that. And that's relatively unusual. I talk to people in different industries about this stuff, and sometimes I get I don't understand your job. We never talk about this stuff. We just, have to get on with the work. So yeah, I think what makes tech unique is that we care about high performing teams and psychological safety.
I love that. It's definitely something that's come up before a few times of how the communication between tech teams is generally really strong. And I'm talking very generally, but in terms of, and I always found that very interesting, as someone who is never been involved in a tech team, that there's this kind of whole cliche or this stereotype, if you want, that people that work in tech, or especially developers, especially anyone that kind of works on back end or anything like that, they're always kind of perceived as these unsocial kind of little goblins that just kind of work at the back in IT, but they're actually super collaborative people, and they get the job done, right? So, and I always found that really interesting. So we've established what psychological safety is and what it means within a tech team. How, as a manager, can you instill psychological safety?
Yeah, I can only talk about this from my own perspective, because how I approach this is very much guided by my own personal values. And the personal values that I think are relevant here are curiosity, being interested in people, being interested in problems, being open, being willing to share, being willing to be honest, and being vulnerable. I think being willing to admit that when you make a mistake, or say that you were wrong, or say that you didn't understand something, or admit that someone's idea was better than yours. And I think these are good general values. How you apply them, they just depend on your person. And so when you take those values into a team and encourage everyone to kind of operate by those in their own way, you demonstrate them by how you talk about your own mistakes, how you talk about other people when they make mistakes, especially when you talk about people who aren't in the room. Because people pay attention. You can pay lip service to psychological safety. You can say, bring your whole self to work. It's all right to make mistakes. And then when someone in another team does something stupid, and we go, oh, that person's such an idiot. I can't believe they made that mistake. It was so obvious. Like it sends the message that you don't respect people, and that you might talk about them like that when they're not in the room. So you really demonstrate that kind of, and that's empathy, and that's understanding, and that's acceptance, and demonstrating that stuff. But then on the positive side, you celebrate people. You celebrate their strengths, their successes, their individuality, like what makes them good, what makes them different. You kind of embrace that difference. You're not trying to homogenize everyone or make everyone look the same. And that's stuff that everyone in the team needs to do. That's not special. That's not something special that a manager should do and that the team just follows along. Like a psychological safe team is one where every team member kind of is owning that work. And what a manager can bring is maybe some more experience in doing that, and the time and energy to like coach the individuals in the team to help them on their journey of doing that. And then using your power to like show that it's safe for people with less power and less influence to also be vulnerable, to also be open, to also make mistakes, and it be okay.
Yeah, I think as well, something that stood out there when you said it's because it reminded me of kind of friendship groups as well, and kind of friendship circles of if somebody's kind of, talking about somebody when they're not in the room and to defend themselves, and you then instantly, like, you have no choice. You instantly don't really trust that person to not say the same thing about you when you leave that room. And it totally applies to the workplace as well. And you're right. And then I think that it in itself, even though that's obviously only one of the things you spoke about, that in itself is super tricky to kind of manage. I think it's not obviously just a case of kind of, oh, how are you doing today? How are you feeling in yourself, sort of thing. You need to be monitoring that person and monitoring their behavior and monitoring the conversations that they're having with the other team members and things like that, because it is really important. And I think there's this also kind of bad rep that sometimes whenever psychological safety comes up, a lot of people think, well, I want my team feeling safe, but I don't want them feeling too relaxed. Like, I don't want them just thinking that anything goes and that I'm not going to bother kind of coming down on them if they're not doing anything right. Then, so how can you kind of, because I personally, I'm totally with you, Gavin, and I think you'll probably say the same, that I don't think psychological safety means complacency. But for a lot of managers, that might be the reason that they're not really willing to edge into it as much, or that they don't believe that their team will see it that way and that will actually get complacent. So how can you kind of make sure that doesn't happen, that triggering psychological safety doesn't then have a knock-on effect of complacency in your team?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And like, I can tell you my story and my journey through this, because I come at it from maybe the more soft end of things, the more like letting things slide and like being too focused on that kind of thing. Psychological safety is just one of the foundations of a high-performing team. It's not all of it. It needs to be there, but it's not the whole picture. So my story is like, I like to say I'm a recovering people pleaser. The joke I always make is like, welcome to People Pleasers Anonymous. I'm Gav. I hope that's okay with you. And it's because that's been my life. Like what I think what made me good at being a manager is my intuition, my empathy, my passion for people. But I got good at that because I spent my whole life feeling like I had to. And so I brought that energy to work and brought that real care for people to work. But what I also brought with that, before I was able to examine it, was this feeling that I needed people to like me. I needed people to be happy. If they were happy, if they're okay, I'm okay. If they're not okay, I'm not okay. And so it meant that I focused too much on making sure that they were okay and happy, and kind of, in a sense, giving them what they wanted, what they said they wanted, and not what they needed. And also not focusing losing sight of the fact that we are a team inside a business working towards a mission. We are building something that we want to deliver to other people. So I put more energy into like pleasing the people that were close to me and not my stakeholders or not the end users, and then not teaching the team themselves to focus not just on themselves, but to equally focus on the needs of the stakeholders and the needs of users. So yeah, and that's very much taken some work. So, we talk about complacency, by hyper-focusing on that one aspect, psychological safety of a high-performing team, it kind of robs them of the ability to truly become high-performing. And a high-performing team is willing to take risks in service of their mission. A high-performing team is willing to do work that isn't fun, that doesn't feel good, that is maybe not what they want to do. A high-performing team who feel safe can disagree but commit and do it and give it their best shot. A team that is safe but high performing can say yes and to a challenge that comes with them, is willing to have an awkward conversation and deal with a problem early on instead of letting it like slide because you don't want to offend someone, you don't want to hurt their feelings. So you avoid complacency by realizing that you're there to deliver. You're there to deliver on your mission. And so you encourage people, in yourself and individuals in the team, to focus on the outcomes, to focus on the needs of users, of the actual people, the actual humans you're building for, and not just your own joy, needs, goals, etc.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. And especially the psychologically safe team will feel motivated and therefore will be high performing. And I know you said it's just one of the elements, but it's so important, isn't it? And especially, I love that you brought up people pleasing as well, because I did kind of want to tap into that a little bit, because when you think psychological safety, I kind of said before, it's not a case of just asking your team how they're all doing and then they all say fine and you just get on with the rest of your day. There's a, you need to be able to still make decisions and still be kind of assertive. But does kind of be ensuring that your team is psychologically safe, does that kind of instill maybe a passiveness about a manager, or is that something to be avoided, do you think? Like, how do you think the kind of balance of being passive and being assertive comes into play when it comes to psychological safety?
Yeah, I think balance is the key there, very much. I think we've all had or experienced bosses who didn't care about us. We're just hyper focused on the work, and we're and we're just like hard, very domineering and direct. And for people like me, I mean, this was my experience. I experienced managers who weren't caring, and so I almost went to the opposite extreme. I was like, no, I'll never be like that. I will like care for my people. I will love them and make sure that they're happy and all right, But that was it took me years to realize one extreme is just as bad as the other extreme. Like, by being way too soft and not where the domineering manager is hyper focused on delivering and getting stuff done, the soft manager is hyper focused on people's comfort but is not delivering, and I was doing myself a disservice and the team is a disservice. So exactly what you said, balance is doing the right thing at the right time. There's a time for like slowing down and being gentle and soft and taking a moment, and there's a time for, we don't have time for this, we need to focus on the goal. There's a time for we can't spend ages talking about this problem, we need to make a decision. I'm going to put some boundaries in place and say we are making a decision by the end of this meeting, or your attitude in that meeting is unacceptable. I'm not going to allow it. From now on, I'm going to call you out on that, and we're going to work to improve that. Or just saying, this is the roadmap. We agreed we would follow the roadmap. I know you think that your ideas are better, and they probably are, but we made a commitment to, deliver on this thing, and we need to follow through and do that, even though you don't enjoy it. So it really is very much about finding a balance, not being one extreme or that. And I think I came through years of like being too much of one extreme as an overreaction, And it's taken me time and feedback and reflection and like good people around me to like help pull me back and see the value in finding balance and always striving towards like making a balanced choice in the moment.
Yeah, I think especially when you brought up like people pleasing before, it struck me because I'd probably say that I was a bit of a people pleaser as well. But kind of as I think as you're climbing the ladder, you do kind of need to not grow out of that, but because you don't want to lose that part of you as a person. But
Mm.
I think it is in a professional environment, it's so difficult to not kind of to lose to intentionally lose that those values and keep it in the workplace and be assertive, like you said. And there's a time and a place for it, and it is just finding that balance, isn't it? So
Yeah.
is there I mean, I know obviously there is a difference between psychological safety and people pleasing, but where's the mentality at for someone who wants their team to feel safe and someone who doesn't want to come across as a people pleaser?
Um, I think if you if you are giving in too much to people pleasing and see that as being as see that if you believe you have to people please to create psychological safety, you're probably going too far in one extreme. Psychological safety doesn't just come from making people happy and making people feel good and doing whatever you can to make that happen. Psychological safety comes from very much involves risk taking, involves making mistakes, involves moving quickly, involves making difficult decisions, involves experiencing discomfort and surviving it and moving through it. And so if you focus, if you don't understand your people pleasing and you focus too much on that, you rob people of those opportunities to you rob them opportunities to make mistakes. You rob them opportunities to learn from critical feedback. Yeah, I'm not sure. Did that catch the gist of your question?
Yeah, no, fully, because I think especially when you're kind of saying like you are robbing people of an opportunity to make mistakes, if they don't feel safe enough to take the risk in the first place. And I think that's definitely, if you're going into it with that mindset, then you know you're not going to feel like a people pleaser because you actually are just providing them with a platform, and you're not going to go too, like you said, too far into the extreme of it. Because I think it's really wonderful what you said about you're a recovering people pleaser, and it took you a while to realize that you'd gone a little bit too far into the other way because of what your past experiences had said. Right, you need to be not like that person, be a better person, and be the opposite. But then going too far can actually, you need pulling back a little bit to help your team out. And I absolutely love that. So you mentioned stakeholders there as well. What's the kind of best way to manage stakeholder expectations? And what's the kind of most effective and healthiest way to communicate those expectations to your team?
I think bring similar values, honesty, openness, vulnerability. If you're moving away from people pleasing and focusing on general psychological safety, you want to expand that beyond your team. You want your team to treat other teams, treat their stakeholders with the same kind of psychological safety, being willing to engage with their needs, listen to what they want, hear difficult messages, convey difficult messages. So in terms of like managing your team and managing stakeholder expectations, you want to be honest back. You want to say no. If you can't, you want to be open about your work, about your challenges, about why you make the decisions you make. And you want to teach people in your team to do the same thing. But in the same way, also, sometimes you need to tell your team, yes, I know the plan was X last week. This week it's Y. We need to pivot and do something. And yes, change is uncomfortable, and doing what we don't want to do is uncomfortable. And sometimes you just go, yeah, I know this really sucks. Let's have a bit of a whinge. Okay, the time for whinging is over. We're going to get on with it now. So yeah, I think just focusing on the core values of psychological safety, as at least I feel them, being curious, being honest, being open, being vulnerable, and extending that trust, not just keeping trust inside your team, but extending that trust to people outside.
Yeah, I love those values, especially. I'm gonna definitely try and write that down somewhere and try and keep them in mind, because it's not, because it's not simple at all. But you need these values to kind of keep your kind of structure with what you're trying to implement when it comes to psychological safety. With that in mind, what kind of mistakes, or however you want to phrase it, what mistakes can be made? What obstacles might you encounter as a leader when you're trying to kind of instill this psychological safety? It could be any scenario. It could be a brand new team that you've just hired. It could be an experienced team that you've joined, or it could just be that you're looking for a change in the waves with a team that you've been with for a while. So what are the solutions as well?
Yeah. I can probably talk a lot about, with a lot of clarity, about problems. Talking about solutions is maybe a bit more complicated, because people are complicated, and teams and companies are complicated. A few of the common scenarios that I see is you might get a team that really embraces psychological safety and like builds this culture of openness and honesty and connection, but they then stray too far and become proud and start to see themselves as better than other teams and start to kind of put walls up between them and other teams. So I said at the beginning, like how you talk about people aren't in the room. A team that is safe and high performing and enjoys their work might go too far and go, oh, we're better than another team. Oh, that team is stupid. They aren't providing us the stuff we need fast enough, or they're annoying. They don't show the same kindness and vulnerability and acceptance and openness that they show to themselves. And that's just very much about like managing a culture that treats other teams, stakeholders, users with the same respect you want to treat yourselves with, and not see yourselves as better. Really, that's just veering to an extreme and trying to pull back. And that just, you solve that by just like talking about it, working it, reflecting on people's words and actions and behaviors. Another challenge I see is teams getting too inward focused and getting too excited about like, they're willing to take risks. They're willing to talk about difficult problems. They're willing to like address things and take things on, but they get too focused on their idea of what the problems are and their idea of what the solutions are, and they lose track of the users. They lose track of the actual stakeholder needs of other teams, and they get too focused on the stuff that they think is great. And so they become a bit of an island, a bit of a silo. And the solution to that is to always have feedback loops, to teach high-performing teams that you're focusing on the end goal, you're focusing on the users, you're focusing on your stakeholders, not just yourselves, that you are part of a greater thing, an ecosystem. You're not just a unit. You are a unit, but you're part of a bigger thing, and to see yourself as part of that bigger thing. Another one that I see as a challenge is building psychological safety inside an organization that isn't safe, where you might try to talk about psychological safety and, at worst you get shouted down or told that's a waste of time, or at best, you get told, yeah, that's a good idea, but we don't have time. We have to get the stuff done by the end of the quarter. So like, get on with it. Or an organization that allows toxic leadership to stick around or can't focus on that. So you end up trying as a manager to protect your team and build psychological safety inside of a space that isn't safe. That's really common. That's really hard. And I think I would say to people to accept that there's only so much you can do. You have to remind yourself of what you do have influence over and what you don't have influence over. So if you're in an organization that is struggling, that is hard, that is difficult, that doesn't embrace psychological safety on the whole, you can still work to create psychological safety in the space you have influence over. But to accept that a lot of your work might be protecting that, might be encouraging them to still show kindness to others, even when they're not receiving kindness in return. And that maybe that's just the best you can do in a different situation, and that's okay. You're not going to be able to fix the whole organization unless you run it.
Yeah, I think that hits hard, doesn't it? Really, that one of you can't necessarily just walk away from a job if there's no psychological safety. But if you have a team, and especially saying there that a lot of your energy is going to go into not even setting it up, not even implementing it, not even the actual doing of checking in on your team, but just protecting what you've kind of built already is going to, because you can face, you might face some backlash, or you might get questioned about it, and just making sure that your team are feeling mentally safe, because they're going to experience other people in the company who aren't in that team and aren't in that lovely bubble of kind of, psychological safety, essentially. And that is a shame. But it sounds like, you've obviously experienced that yourself, and it does sound really tricky. And no, it's such an interesting thing to get into, and especially when I think obviously a lot of our listeners are kind of people who are looking to work their way up. And I think maybe this is the kind of episode where people who aren't even leaders or aren't leaders yet could listen and kind of think of ways that they think, because you don't have to be a leader to implement these things, do you? You can kind of have a chat with your manager, or you can have a chat with your colleagues, and you can kind of just think, well, if you think maybe this isn't quite working out, or I don't really feel like I could take a risk and not kind of have my wrist slapped for it, or that I don't feel like I don't feel creative, I think that's another quite important aspect of feeling safe. Especially in the creative industry, for an example, like you can't feel like, a lot of them even say you don't have to come in at a certain time in the morning. You just come in when you feel like it, because you need that freedom to feel safe enough to be creative. You can't force it. And I think that's the same in terms of tech, because there's so much focus time and so much collaboration, and a lot of tech teams are so efficient and so targeted towards being a high performing team that psychological safety becomes even more important. And if it's not there, like you said earlier, it is going to affect motivation so much. And if toxic leadership is still there as well, like you said, it's just not going to stick around. It's not going to be able to stick if your team can't hack it. So what an amazing conversation. Like, I'm actually a little bit gutted that we've kind of just nearing the end of it. Well, I could honestly talk about this for hours. I'm genuinely really interested in this, because it applies across every industry. It's not just tech, but obviously the focus is on tech today, which I think is even more interesting, because like we say, it's a weird old industry, tech, isn't it? And there's a lot of differences between that, and there's a lot of uniqueness to tech that we've chatted about. But I will kind of finish on one question that I do ask a lot of my guests, and it's what kind of advice would you have for someone? I usually say, like, looking to be in your position one day, so that as well, but then kind of the second part to that question, what kind of advice would you have to someone who's looking to implement psychological safety, be it, a junior dev up to a CTO, for example?
I'll start with the second question, like, what can you do? One of my sayings, it's not my saying, I stole it from somewhere, is the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. If you expect psychological safety to be someone else's responsibility, then you're not demonstrating that. So even as a junior engineer, you can show compassion, you can accept mistakes with kindness, you can let people take risks, you can let people be wrong. But you may not have a lot of power. So if you're just some junior individual contributor in a team, you can bring up these topics. You can tell people that, hey, I think we could do as a team with working on psychological safety, and you'll probably find that other people want the same thing and are willing to put the work in and talk about it if you bring it up, if you try and with kindness and gentleness drive it. You can make a difference inside of your team. As you move up the ranks, if you're the CTO or owner of a company, you have a lot of power, you have a lot of authority. You get to set the standard. The people that you manage, you get to guide them in building psychological safety teams. In much the same way, like I spoke earlier about, like, people watching how you talk. When you're in leadership, like, a lot of eyes on you, and you start to forget perhaps like what room you're in, or how your email sounded, or the tone of that Slack message. And people will get a sense, rightly or wrongly, of how safe it is to make mistakes and take risks based on the way you talk. So in a way, the further you go up in leadership, the more of responsibility you have to be aware of your impact. But you also have a lot of power to have a positive impact. And I think it's important to use that power to spend that energy on building psychological safety and setting a high and maintaining a high standard of people with people. I think it's everyone's responsibility. In terms of getting to be in a similar position to me, know what your values are, be passionate, stick to them even when it hurts, be willing to realize that you've been wrong for years and apologize, and look back and go, yeah, okay, I could definitely have done better in that situation. I can see why that worked out the way it did. And give yourself the kindness and acceptance that you want to give to other people. Go, okay, from now on, I'm going to do differently, even though I've been doing it poorly before now. And I think that's just a good general way of treating yourself and treating other people. Like, that won't necessarily get you to be into management or get you to be a consultant, but I think it will very much help you with building psychological safety in yourself and really modeling that to the people that are around you that you come to contact with.
Yeah, unbelievable words there. I think especially about that kind of last point of giving yourself psychological safety as an individual is probably the most important kind of mindset that you could have, because you've got the confidence, you've got the reassurance of yourself without being too cocky. You can make decisions and be able to stand by them, if you're not confident in yourself. And I think that word confidence kind of comes into psychological safety a lot, doesn't it? But I feel like that's a whole nother episode, which I'd love to do, don't get me wrong. But yeah, so honestly, Gavin, thank you so much. I've actually really loved this episode, and like I say, I think I really wish I'd kind of prepared double the amount of questions, so we could have just gone on and on about it, because there's so much to cover when it comes to this kind of thing, about mentality from a leader down to their team, and making sure, this, we've just touched on one psychological safety point today, but I think there's so much more that can be talked about, and hopefully we can kind of start a conversation about this, and hopefully people can really get to grips with it, and in 10, 20 decades, years time, it becomes completely normal to have this kind of mentality within teams, and there's no kind of toxicity or anything like that. But that is the dream, isn't it? No toxicity anywhere, ever, in any.
It's the dream.
It is the dream, and we're living the dream over here on the Live Series podcast. So if you're watching on YouTube, what a terrible segue. If you're watching YouTube or listening on Spotify, you can hit subscribe. Don't miss a single episode from us. There's honestly so many more fascinating subjects like this hanging around over there. So you can follow us on social media as well. Our handle is @AmicusJobs. Head over to our website, amicusjobs.com, for tech news, roundtables, webinars, and all the other episodes. Any software engineers listening as well, we've got loads of really cool new roles up there. Gavin, honestly, thank you so much. I've absolutely loved this one.
Thank you.